right. Oh, this is on, right? Hello? Yeah. Okay, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us at today's Link event, 2022 Qatar World Cup, Sports, Politics, and Human Rights. Today's panel discussion will be followed by a Q&A with our in-person audience. After around 30 minutes, our moderator will announce when it is time for audience questions. At this time, you can make your way to one of the two microphones located in the aisles to ask questions. If you are new to the Link program, welcome. My colleague Shana Katz is going to tell you a little bit more about the Link program now.
LINK, which stands for Law Informed Network No, is the Washington Institute for Near East Policy's Young Professionals program. We host a variety of events throughout the year aimed at deepening our understanding of key topics in foreign affairs, as well as the different career paths available to young professionals interested in international affairs.
We have an outstanding panel this evening, and it is our pleasure to now introduce the members of our distinguished panel. Joining us in person tonight is Marty Flax, who is the Khoshrabi Chair in Principled Internationalism and the Director of the Human Rights Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
And joining us virtually is Susan Ziadeh, who served for 23 years in the State Department, most recently as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Arabian Peninsula Affairs from 2014 to 16. She also served as Ambassador to Qatar from 2011 to 2014. James Dorsey is also joining us virtually. He is a senior fellow at the National University of Singapore's Middle East Institute and the author of the column and blog, The Turbulent World of Middle East Soccer.
This discussion will be moderated by the Washington Institute's Morningstar Senior Fellow and Director of Research, Patrick Clausen, who also directs the Institute's Viterbi program on Iran and U.S. policy. And with that, I'd like to hand the floor off to Patrick to officially kick off the discussion.
Thank you very much. That we are distinguished about human rights and Middle East politics. If you came this evening hoping to learn who's going to win the 2022 World Cup, you're going to be disappointed. That's not what we're talking about tonight. What we're talking about is politics and human rights. And I take a particular interest in this because of all the things that I've written over the years, 30 books. Something that I wrote about soccer got the most attention of anything I ever wrote. And that's when I wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, and I was saying, how could we, in the United States, step up our pressure on Iran with sanctions? And I suggested if you really want to catch the attention of the Iranian people, what you should do is ban Iran from the World Cup. This got me more death threats than anything that I've ever written in my life. And the FBI calling up its concern, and IranianSoccer.com had castigated me, let's put it that way. So with that as a starter, let me ask our panelists, the award of the 2022 World Cup to Qatar got quite a lot of flack at the time that it happened, and concern about human rights, what would happen with human rights in Qatar. So looking back over all these many years, how do you think things have gone? How do you think things have progressed in getting human rights on the agenda with the Qatari government? And let me start with Susan, if I may, and then we'll go to Jim and Marty.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, thanks for the invitation to be with you today. It's great to be here with such distinguished panelists and a great audience. I arrived in Qatar in the summer of 2011, so it was right after the awarding of the World Cup. And one of the things that the embassy and our team focused on very early on was the issue of human rights, and particularly labor law and labor issues for the migrant workers who were working there. And to my a bit surprised, but also I was pleased to find out that actually in meeting with the Supreme Committee, this was very much on their minds. They wanted to work on this issue. They knew that the world was watching. They also understood that having been awarded the World Cup with such scrutiny, that they were in a position whereby they could set an example for the region on workers' issues, in particular labor. So this was an important issue for them, but they also understood that they were working in an environment which was unaccustomed to addressing these issues in the way that the West understood that they needed to be addressed. So this was a steep learning curve for them. I'd like to think that they've done pretty well. We can discuss that more. But needless to say that this was very clear to them from the beginning, and they understood that as a small country, they had the ability to harness the resources to address it in an important way.
Great, Jim. What are your views on how things have gone since the awarding of these games to Qatar?
I think much of what Susan said is absolutely correct. What I would add to that is a couple of things. First of all, I think that there's a sharp contrast between the way that Qatar was able to handle its during the Saudi UAE-led economic boycott, where they showed enormous resilience, wherewithal, and creativity. They did less so in some respects with regard to the issues around the World Cup. I think, first of all, talkies were taken by surprise by just the vehemence of the criticism. And the initial response was, at least in public affairs terms, to let it all blow over. Fact of the matter is, it didn't blow over. I think the second point to point out is that the Supreme Committee, the organizer of the World Cup, indeed understood the issues, maybe somewhat quicker and somewhat earlier than other parts of the Qatari government, and therefore what the Supreme Committee would have liked to have done at certain moments and what they were able to do were two different things. Now, having said all of that, fact of the matter is, and you can argue it hasn't gone far enough, it hasn't gone fast enough. The Qataris often were dragged into things rather than grabbing the bull by the horns and being proactive rather than reactive. But fact of the matter is that, first of all, Qatar is the only Gulf state to have engaged with its critics. And at a moment that critics either are behind bars or worse, if they're domestic critics, and if they're foreign critics, they can't get on an outbound flight particularly to the UAE or Saudi Arabia. Qatar invited them in and worked with them. So in some ways, even if human rights groups and others are not happy with the end result, engagement did pay off and did lead to significant change.
Marty, what's your view?
Yeah, thanks. So first of all, it's great to be here talking about football. I'm a Cleveland baseball fan. So for those of you following the baseball playoffs, it's nice to talk about another sport for me today. I largely agree with the assessment that it's been a mixed bag. I think just maybe a word of context about the issues that we're talking about so we can kind of address how far they've come. So just so folks are on the same page, we're talking about a situation where the majority of the workforce in Qatar is made up of foreign migrant workers from South Asia, from the Philippines, who are brought in largely by recruitment companies to work on every sector from construction to hospitality to home services, et cetera. And you're talking about, 20 million migrant workers in the Gulf. 95% of the workforce is in Qatar is migrant workers because of the tiny population and the huge needs. And when the World Cup came in, those huge needs magnified exponentially. You're talking about new stadiums, new hotels, new transportation infrastructure. And the system that the Qataris have used and the other Gulf countries have used, the kafala system, has been a system that has historically been extremely abusive to migrant workers. It severely restricts their ability to move freely, to speak freely, to get out of abusive working conditions. So if their living or working conditions are unsafe, it's difficult to leave. And of course, there's no sort of freedom of association or ability to organize in any of these countries. And so that's the situation in which the World Cup was awarded to Qatar more than 10 years ago. I think it's absolutely right to say that award led to an incredible amount of scrutiny in Qatar and did lead to a significant amount of engagement by the government in these issues. It took them a long time to put in place some of the reforms that they needed to do. So it's really in the last 2 years that we've started to actually see some changes. Things like getting rid of the requirement that you have an exit permit from your employer before you can leave. So if you're in an abusive situation and you just want to go home, you have to get your abusive employer's permission to go. They finally got rid of that in 2020. They put in place a more realistic minimum wage and better protections to make sure workers actually get paid that wage in 2021. So we've seen progress thanks to the really robust engagement and focus of the International Labor Organization, of human rights NGOs, of migrant worker organizations, and some support from FIFA itself to make some changes. There's still a long way to go, and we'll get into that in terms of what else needs to happen. But I think over time, yes, they've made significant progress. They have still some things to do.
So, Jim, you just wrote an article, it just got published, about how this is a make or break moment for Qatar. I recommend people look it up. It's a very detailed discussion about what's happened, but also about how to judge what will happen. And I'd be interested in your thoughts about what are the 3 or 4 things we ought to really be paying attention to if we want to understand how well the World Cup is going as it unfolds.
I think the thing to keep in mind here is it's a different cultural context and a different legal context. So if you're used in a World Cup, significant consumption of alcohol, expression of affections publicly, irrespective of whether that's between heterosexual couples or same-sex couples, those are all issues in Qatar. Now, to be fair to the Qataris, they're trying, and how that will work out, we will see during the World Cup itself. They're trying to accommodate these things. So alcohol is not freely available in Qatar. It's available in high-end hotels. If you're a resident, there's a shop where you can get it, but it's not in every corner, and you're not allowed to consume it publicly. So the Qataris have thought of trying to address that by having fan zones where alcohol can be consumed. Public drunkenness, public intoxication is banned. Shirtless, so taking off your shirt in the stadium is banned. And obviously, sexual gender diversity is not recognized legally. And the Qataris have sought to address those issues in various ways. In the most recent one, you had the CEO of the World Cup organizer for the first time say that men holding hands in public would not be a public issue. It was the first time that there was a much more concrete statement than we welcome everybody and we expect them to respect our cultural norms. I think the major issue, so how Qatar addresses those issues, and they brought in a lot of support for law enforcement and for security from a variety of countries, from Pakistan to Turkey to France to the United States to Britain. But how Qatar handles those issues is going to define, I think, in the ultimate analysis, what the soft power benefit of the World Cup will be for Qatar, and how the World Cup will be remembered and perceived in the international community.
Susan, would you care to comment about how controversial you think all this is in Qatar? Is there going to be significant opposition to these measures, like allowing alcohol, like allowing public displays of affection, or is this something people say, oh, okay, well, that's the price we have to pay to get this World Cup?
Well, you know, it's always a fine line. In the past, when there have been experiments of alcohol in restaurants in large areas like the area of the Pearl, which was the case in the around 2012, 13, Once there was public drunkenness out in the streets as a result of that, everything got shut down. There wasn't a lot of tolerance from that because there was criticism of the government. Now, for the World Cup, it's a different issue because the World Cup is part of their branding. It's part of their identity. It's part of how small states identify, have more of a notoriety in a positive sense with other countries in the world. It's how you establish linkages commercially, economically, across the board. And so I think there is a great understanding that in order to play in the big leagues like a World Cup, there has to be some, shall we say, a loosening of the restrictions and a more tolerance in terms of what will be accepted. The other thing is many people in Qatar will benefit economically from all of these people there, the amount of spending that's taken place, the spending that has taken place in terms of the infrastructure development. I mean, the Qataris are very proud of their country and what it's become, and the fact that they're hosting the World Cup, and the fact that they're the first country in the Arab world or the Islamic world. So I think that will buy the government a lot of leeway with the more conservative elements in the population in terms of a cost-benefit analysis. And I think they will go forward. I agree with James that how the Qataris work the law enforcement piece of it so that you don't have small incidents turn into large incidents in this day of social media is going to be important in how they preserve the soft power benefit of hosting the World Cup, and so it doesn't redound against them.
Marty, could you say a few words about how the human rights and labor community is looking at what are they paying attention to? What are they going to focus on as the World Cup takes place?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, as we move into this phase of execution of the games versus that kind of run up and construction piece, they're really looking at the freedom of speech, freedom of expression issues, right? I think as much as I like to enjoy a beer at a stadium, I think the issue of whether alcohol is permitted and where is frankly not a major issue for human rights groups. It's just not. But the question of if you chant a political slogan or something that's perceived to be political, if you are, with a man with his husband or a woman with her girlfriend, holding hands in a stadium or chanting a LGBTQ slogan, things like that, if that is the subject of law enforcement action, if that is cracked down on that, that's going to be something that's very concerning. There's been some restrictions on the film crews that have arrived in advance who are looking into things like how migrant workers are living, being able to film, and they're sort of controlling where you can film and where you can't, and what you can report on, what you can't. So I think those kinds of freedom of expression issues are really going to be the major factor in how as these guys were saying, how the human rights community views the execution of the games. And then there's another set of issues around what happens to the workers who are working the games, who are still in Qatar, or who have left Qatar but have faced abuses and issues as a result of their work in Qatar and are now asking for compensation. And so there's a very big effort right now by human rights groups and labor groups to convince FIFA and the soccer teams and the Qataris to provide some compensation for the workers who were injured or killed in the process of putting these World Cup pieces together. And I think you'll see that sprinkled throughout the games as well, those kinds of calls for remediation, for compensation for those who were harmed in the process.
Susan, could you say a few words about the controversy about whether there was money changed hands in order for Qatar to get this?
I mean, I really can't comment on that just because I have no clue. To be quite honest, I didn't know much about the world of football or soccer or FIFA or anything like that until I was named ambassador to Qatar. And all of a sudden I had to get smart very quickly. So I can't really comment on that, except that there are investigations, there are public records. Those who had been held accountable have been held accountable and removed from office. To my knowledge, nothing has ever been found that has pointed a finger to Qatar. And that's a matter of public record where FIFA and the investigative committees have have done their work. So I would say that the public record should speak for itself.
Jim, could you say a few words about what you anticipate that some of the teams that are playing in the World Cup, are they going to be trying to express their solidarity with protesters or with free speech, or are we going to see issues about what they're wearing on their uniforms and that sort of thing?
Let me, if I can put it into a bigger context before I go into a little bit of detail. I think one of the problems with all of this is that the debate about Qatar has been blurred, if you wish. With other words, you have very genuine issues, whether that's labor, whether that's freedom of expression, whether that's LGBTQ rights. And then you have a layer of what I would describe as bias, prejudice, and sour grapes. And that gets all mixed into one. And so that in many ways has shaped perception, particularly in Europe and among American fans, less so in other parts of the world. Now, having said that, the Europeans particularly are intent on taking a stand on the labor issue as well as the LGBTQ issue during the match itself. First of all, many of the European federations, together with US Soccer, have formed a working group in which they're trying to get a fund established that would use some of the revenues of the World Cup or Qatari funds to compensate workers who suffered injury or worse deaths as a result of the World Cup. And you're going to see, although that has not yet been formally ruled on, the Europeans wanting to wear One Love bands, the Danish football team having a black jersey with no logo to commemorate those who died on World Cup related construction sites. It's going to be interesting to see what happens, because under FIFA rules, you are not allowed to express a political or religious opinion on the pitch. And that's exactly what the Europeans are planning to do. The Qataris have taken the attitude, it's a FIFA matter. And so the question is now going to be, what does FIFA say?
So Marty, how do human rights organizations look at this? I mean, what lessons have they drawn from the experience of Qatar winning the World Cup and the Europeans organizing to try to demonstrate on the football field?
Yeah, I mean, look, the Europeans are 10 or 12 years late on their protests, right? So I appreciate the gestures of the armbands and the uniforms. You know, what I used to work for an NGO working on this issue, and what they said is ask questions about the hotel you're staying at. How are they treating the workers that are cleaning your rooms or serving your food, right? Do some smart decision making about your engagement financially with this tournament, rather than sort of just the symbolic piece. You know, I think there's been a lot of lessons learned though from this experience, not least from FIFA. And I think it's important to point out, you know, the backlash that FIFA faced from this was so severe that they put in place for the first time their own human rights policy and required the bidders on the next World Cup, the World Cup that will now go to the US, Mexico, and Canada, to put together a human rights plan as part of their bid. And that plan got evaluated as one of the bid criteria. And so there was an extensive process in the US with the bid cities to put together their strategy for how they will, what the key human rights issues are in those cities that could be affected by the games, and how they will ensure that the World Cup is a human rights benefit and not a human rights risk. And I think the decision to award the games to the US, Canada, and Mexico was in part because they felt it was safe on human rights grounds. Not that we don't have plenty of human rights issues in those countries, but the scale and the scope are going to look very different here than they were in Qatar. And so I think FIFA felt like that was an easier move. Human rights groups and labor groups, I think, have been have welcomed the engagement and the attention that the World Cup gave to Qatar. It did give them an opening, as the other folks mentioned, to engage that might not have been there otherwise. So that's a positive. I think it's a little dangerous to extrapolate that to every sporting situation. We haven't seen that opportunity, for example, in the Beijing Olympics twice now. Certainly did not create an opening for dialogue with China, and the IOC is certainly not tried in the same way that FIFA has to have that dialogue. We don't see it with sort of Saudi Live Golf. Is not an opportunity to engage Saudi on human rights at all. So there's ways that you can use this attention in these tournaments to have that conversation, but I wouldn't extrapolate from this that that's automatically going to be the case if you give an autocratic or human rights abusing regime an opportunity like this, that it necessarily means they're going to engage with you.
Susan, would you say a few words about what impact you think the Qatar's experience with the World Cup has had on other countries in the region? We've seen a lot of changes, and particularly in Saudi Arabia. Has any of this been influenced by the World Cup, or was it quite independent?
Well, I think the neighbors in the region are always looking to see what the others are doing. And I think for some people in the region and some governments, there was a bit of chagrin that a small country like Qatar was the first to step up and win the World Cup. So that said, I think the fact that Qatar will lay down markers on a whole host of issues, including labor, human rights, but also other kinds of branding and expansion of sports as a way of diversifying their economy and developing new economic models, is an important thing for the other countries, of course, which they also will want to emulate. After all, these countries in the Persian Gulf, the neighbors, are pretty much carbon economies, and they are all looking to figure out how they can diversify economically, but also the value of soft power in sports and how they can create a better reputation for themselves on the world stage. And of course, sports is a good way to do that. So certainly you see it in Saudi Arabia, you see it in the UAE, and you will see it in other countries that will try to vie for hosting other kinds of games in the future.
Jim, can you remind us about the role that sports has played in these other countries? I mean, whether it's Formula One racing or wrestling, or the awarding of the Winter Asian Games to Saudi Arabia. I'm looking forward to downhill skiing in Saudi Arabia in 2029. Just remind us a little bit, please, about the role that sports has played in these Gulf countries.
I think there's been an evolution. So if you wish, the Middle East is probably the region where sports, and particularly soccer, has played a key role from the day it was introduced into the region, in terms of nation building, in terms of nation formation, in terms of regime survival, in terms of protest, just go down the line. The evolution has been since 2011 and the popular Arab revolts in two regards. One is that the, whatever you want to call it, the counter-revolution, but in any case, the concerted effort to roll back the achievements of the popular revolts in 2011 has meant that in a number of countries, stadiums were empty for almost a decade. In Egypt, it's only very recently that the stadium started to be opened to the public because of the potential of protest. And so the evolution has been into the use of sports by regimes to brand themselves, to public diplomacy. I don't like the word sports washing, and I'm not sure that was always the major driver for a tournament. But there is, if countries would handle it well, there would be that offset. In fact, in the case of Qatar, I think hosting the World Cup and other sporting events, but particularly the World Cup, is an element of cementing a national identity and an element of defense and security policy, in which soft power is what would be the real, at the end of the day, in an emergency, the rescue, rather than hard power 300,000 people. Doesn't matter how much sophisticated weaponry you have. You're not going to be lasting long on a conventional battlefield. So as a result of that, what you've seen is that political struggle that the game evokes, or that it offers itself as a platform for, has moved in a sense from the domestic arena to the international arena. So if it was militant football fans 10 years ago, today it's human rights groups, trade unions, Western governments.
Great. Well, let me turn to the audience and see if there's any questions that you all have that you want to pose to our panelists. So please step forward and use one of these mics. The only thing which is off limits is questions about who's going to win which match. Come on. Yeah, go to the mic, please. All right. Well, while we're waiting, I'm going to do a straw poll.
I have a question, Patrick.
Good. All right. Let's hear your question.
My name is Sarah Can. I'm a research assistant at the Washington Institute. And my question is, so the equal pay fight in women's soccer has been huge, particularly with the U.S. women's national team, but also teams across Europe. Do you see that impacting anything with the men's World Cup in Qatar, and what will the reaction be from the Qatari government or any other interested actors?
Who would like to answer that? Jim, you're the obvious suspect. You follow the FIFA politics more than the rest of us.
I just want to make sure that I understood the question. The question was whether or how the World Cup and men's soccer was going to have an impact on women's soccer.
Correct.
Is that correct?
Correct.
Well, I think basically, I mean, again, Qatar is a conservative society, and if you go back to 2012, there were to the Olympics in London, there were 3 countries that had never fielded a woman athlete to an Olympic Games. That was Saudi Arabia, Brunei, and Qatar. The country that responded most proactively to the demand by the International Olympic Committee that women be included among the athletes was actually Qatar. And women do play a public role in Qatar. The Qataris are very good at talking the talk. They're not always as good as walking the walk, if you wish. But on women's issues, and certainly on issues of women's sports, they've been increasingly embracing rather than rejecting it. I'm not sure that the World Cup itself is going to have an impact on that. I think it's much more that the Qataris demands by Qatari women, and you're seeing in public life a number of very impressive Qatari women, and it's also the way they want to be perceived because of the soft power element of that.
Any comments, Mara? No? Okay. Please.
Hi, my name's Maya. And after the World Cup happens, do you see the Qatari government moving anywhere further from the kafala system, or do you see them staying where they are? More reform, less reform? What do you think?
Well, sorry.
Susan?
Yeah, I'll take that. I'll take that one on. I think that I just want to put something out there that I think has been missed a bit. And that is the fact that the Qataris really did take some very early steps in this regard, whether it's kafala or the other labor issues. If you go back to even as early as 2013, so this is like barely 2 years after the award, they had already started working with different firms. And in particular, there was one law firm, DLA Piper out of London, who had come to Qatar and were working very closely. I sat and worked with them quite a bit in terms of they wanted to interview me and ask some of my impressions and concerns. And what they were doing was trying to really do an assessment of the labor situation in Qatar at the request of the Qataris, and with an eye to how to institute ILO standards in terms of the whole reform system. So the Qataris knew early on this was an issue and were taking finite steps. I think part of the issue has always been, as in many countries, what does the government want to do? What does the business community want to do? How quickly can you move forward? What does it look like? And how will you not lose, shall we say, if not legitimacy, but the support of your business community and your population if things move in a direction that others feel have a negative impact on them. So it's always been, as part of the process, a kind of touch and go situation in terms of how they address this. But I think they're very firm in the sense that Qataris, when they've taken steps, whether it's in women's rights, and I agree with James, they've been really in the forefront on a lot of women's issues, they don't backslide. They keep moving forward. And they move forward in part due to stimuli from outside, in part due to the requirements in their own country. Women have to be part of the workforce because they don't have a large population. So they need talented women. And as one minister told me, I don't look at gender, I look at talent. And that's how they view it. But also the fact that they want to be viewed as a country that is inclusive and tolerant and bringing all of the talent to bear. And I do think they will move forward in part due to their own initiative and their sense of need to make themselves a stronger country.
Any comments, Marty?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really great to hear that from someone who knows the government well, that they will, continue to feel motivated even after the scrutiny, the bright lights have gone away. Because I think that's been a significant concern. I do think it's very positive that the relationships have been established with some of the international actors, whether it's the ILO, whether it's BWI, Builders and Woodworkers International Union organization, some of the other labor rights organizations who either have a presence in the country or have very close relationships with the government, to be able to continue those conversations. The U.S. Undersecretary of State for Human Rights and Democracy Issues, Azra Zaya, was out there about 2 weeks ago having these conversations with the Qataris about the World Cup and about migrant worker rights. And so keeping it on the agenda of other partners and continuing that conversation, I think will just continue reinforce the importance of following through on the legal reforms that they've made, that now there's still some legal reforms to make, but the significant ones that they've done now need to be really robustly implemented and enforced. And the changes don't happen unless the law is translated into practice. So continuing to make sure that that's happening, I think, needs to be an equal priority for those organizations and for the U.S. and their engagement with Qatar, even though the World Cup is over and everyone's moved on to the next issue.
I would like to just add one more point, if I may, please. In the recent cabinet, well, it isn't that recent, but actually the last cabinet reshuffle in Qatar, the new labor minister, the previous labor minister was working on these issues, as you say, engagement with a lot of NGOs, et cetera. But the new labor minister, I noticed, is the former head of the National Committee for Human Rights in Qatar. I thought that was significant because the person now taking on the labor portfolio is somebody who for the last 10 years has been working the human rights portfolio within the government. So I just want to make that notation.
Next question, please.
Patrick, can I add 2 very brief points?
Please.
First of all, I think, yes, attention's going to move on from Qatar, but it's not going to move very far away. I mean, as you mentioned, the region is bidding for a variety of different tournaments. Saudi Arabia just got the Asian Winter Games. Qatar got the 2023 Asian Cup. Saudi Arabia is bidding for the 2027 Asian Cup, and together with Egypt and Greece is probably going to be bidding for the 2030 World Cup. So for the Qataris, the pressure on the region from human rights groups and others is going to remain. And for the Qataris, it's going to be a challenge to remain ahead of the game in terms of all of these issues. The second thing I want to just very briefly add, and that goes back to the issue of the debate, there's the distrust between the human rights community or elements of the human rights community and the Qataris is such that many in the human rights community fear or feel that once the spotlights are turned off, Qatar is going to roll this all back. If indeed this is about soft power, that would be wasting a decade of investment and is highly unlikely that it would happen.
Thank you. Please.
All right, thank you for this lively discussion. I was wondering if we could talk about what is the U.S. plan for the U.S.-Iran game, and how are we going to plan to help out with women's rights, particularly in Iran, at this pivotal moment? And I'd like the ambassador maybe to take the first stab at that, answering that.
Well, I'm out of government now, so I would say that the first thing. Look, you know, this issue is something that our government, President Biden, the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, others have made statements about. We continue our engagement on a whole host of issues with Iran, irrespective of our negotiations on the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. We always have done that, and I expect that to continue down the line. For sure, it's going to be a very charged environment between Iran and the U.S. during the game. And I would expect that there will be fans who want to take a political stand. What will be interesting, I think, is how it gets handled at the site. As you know, Qatar has very close relations with the United States, but they also have an engaged relationship with Iran. And so I hope that it's not a situation where Qatar gets put on the hot seat, but I could see that possibly happening.
Next question, please.
Thank you. Good evening. And thank you very much for this very insightful talk. I had a question regarding corruption within the FIFA. So don't you think it may be a bit overstated to state that there is no corruption on record? I mean, when we look at FIFA, we actually see an organization which has a terrible record on graft. And just today, actually, former EUFA chief Michel Platini and former FIFA president Sepp Blatter have been indicted by the Swiss prosecutor for the actions they took as leaders while giving the Qatar. So instead of asking if, can we just go how far corruption has happened when awarding Qatar the World Cup? Thank you so much.
Jim, you follow FIFA politics in great detail. Care to comment?
Sure. Let me put it this way. I think what Susan said earlier in this conversation, that there has not been any hard evidence for wrongdoing in the bid, is correct. Having said that, I'm Johnny come lately to the conclusion that there was wrongdoing in the Qatari bid. The Qataris' misfortune was that they won the bidding rights at the wrong time in the wrong place. So, with other words, it was not the Qatari bid that sparked FIFA corruption and led to the scandal. That's the way business was done in the World Cup, and it wasn't just autocracies that engaged in wrongdoing in the bid. Look at the German bid for the 2006 World Cup. So the Qataris basically did business the way everybody else did business in the World Cup. The problem was that the whole thing exploded in their face. Add to that there were internal rivalries between at a moment of a presidential election in FIFA, between a Qatari national who was a senior Qatari, a senior international soccer executive as president of the Asian Football Confederation and a member of the FIFA Executive Committee, who was doing his own campaigning to challenge the sitting incumbent president of FIFA in an election. And on top of that, you got the geopolitical divisions. And we were speaking earlier about the attitude of and the lessons learned by regional countries. on the one hand, you have particularly the Saudis, but also the United Arab Emirates embracing sports and pumping a lot of money into hosting rights, bringing matches and other athletic events to the kingdom to position itself as a sports hub. And you've had the United Arab Emirates on the war path ever since Qatar won the hosting rights, and only very recently has changed course because one, it's too late, they're not going to reverse it anymore, and two, there's commercial benefit and reputational benefit in the sense that many fans are going to be staying at hotels in Dubai and flying in and out to see matches, and the Arab Emirates and the Emirates is going to want to contrast the social liberalism that exists in a state like Dubai as opposed to the social liberalism that exists in Qatar.
Interesting. I can't add anything to that. That was great.
Okay.
Thank you. My name is Faris Almari. I'm an RA for the Washington Institute here. So first, I want to thank you for coming. This is a really lively and great discussion. So my question is on the term sports washing, and I know Dr. Darcy doesn't really he said he doesn't like using that term, and I'm a big fan of his pieces. I always follow, but I guess my question, and I must admit my bias as a Saudi citizen, that people usually in Saudi or in the Gulf countries, I would say, look at articles written on them again, but hosting those tournaments as sports washing, when people say you're ignoring really legitimate demands by the people. People love soccer, love Formula One, boxing. The turnout is great there, right? So to what extent it's actually sports washing, and to what extent it's actually legitimate, effort by the government to bring those sports because they have the financial capability, for people to go there instead of going to Europe or the States to spend the money outside. Why not spending it inside? So that's part of my question. And also, I think a few days ago, Barney Renee, I guess, I'm not sure if I'm saying the name correctly, but a journalist published a piece in The Guardian saying that, it's forget sports washing, it's hard sports power about what Qatar is doing, basically. So it's even beyond that. So I'm just curious to know, and my question isn't new. I want to know your opinion about this. The argument that says bringing sports to those countries could help liberalize their, societies. I'm just curious about knowing what do you think about that. So, thank you.
Yeah, I can start if you want. I think there are a lot of motivations for governments to bring these kinds of tournaments. There are internal motivations and there are external motivations.
Do you want me to respond to that, Patrick?
Yeah, sure. But first, let's hear a little bit from Marty first.
I think it's, for the most part, particularly when you start talking large scale events like the Olympics, they don't tend to result in a financial benefit, right? But there's a reason why the number of countries hosting the Olympics has shrunk over the years. The number of countries bidding has gotten to a shorter and shorter list. And it's because it doesn't tend to work out financially particularly well for those countries. So you really are talking about sort of a political, social benefit, whether internal or external. I also don't think it's a coincidence that you've got China and Russia bidding to host or trying to host these games over and over again, because they see a benefit. Now, whether that benefit is primarily internal political opportunity to sort of build unity, and these folks both alluded to this, sort of that opportunity to build, to nation build community themselves, and is primarily for internal purposes, or whether that's to put them in a different place on the world stage. I think both of those things can be true at the same time. But I think there's no doubt that these countries that are bidding for these big international tournaments are trying to solidify their reputation and put themselves on a stage internationally. There's no, as we were alluding, there's no logical reason for Saudi Arabia to host winter games other than to say, here we are, come. I don't know how popular those winter sports are there, but they can't be that popular that the government's going to spend a tremendous amount of its own money to host those things. I don't know how popular golf is in Saudi, but the idea of standing up a live golf tournament with some of the most prominent golfers in the world, I think is fairly transparently an effort to put the name out there and see Saudi as a destination internationally, much more than domestically. But that's not to say that there are not domestic benefits to hosting these events, and that something like football, which is incredibly popular in many of these countries, can be a unifying feature, can be something that's positive for those countries. So there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But I think if you look at the universe of countries that have hosted these events, that are consistently bidding on these events, you start to see a really interesting pattern of what kinds of governments those are and how, what they might get out of it. So I'll leave it at that.
Jim, would you care to add something to that?
Yeah, I'd like to make several points. First of all, the reason why I don't like the term sports washing, or before that it was called reputation laundering, is not to deny that that is the fact. But I don't know that it always is the driver to bid for hosting rights and to invest in this. I think it's one of the factors. Second of all, in response to the gentleman's question, absolutely, there's a domestic element to this, and there is certainly in the case of Saudi Arabia the issue of having to cater to the aspirations of a majority youthful population who are looking for not only job opportunity but also for greater opportunity and greater choice in terms of leisure and entertainment. And these are sports crazy countries, and that's one way to do it. I think the third element in all of this is there's an economic factor to this. These are countries that need to, one, diversify their economies away from absolute dependency on oil and gas exports. They need to create opportunities for a rapidly for a youth bulge and a rapidly growing country. And the hosting of these events in terms of boosting the hospitality industry, boosting entertainment, boosting various economic sectors is significant. And that's another reason for them to do it. So in some, sports washing is one element. And in the case of Qatar, again, what Marty said about expenditure, countries do a cost-benefit analysis. What is it worth to risk and spend money on a bid? What is it worth it to you? In the case of the 2010 bid for the 2022 World Cup, it was only worth $10 million to the United States. It was worth $40 million to Australia. To Qatar, whatever the figure is, and we don't know what the figure is, it was worth a multitude, because this was not about branding just simply. It was about defense and security.
Next question, please.
Hello. Thank you for the time you've committed to this evening. My name is Salem. I'm with the delegation of the European Union to the US. As the resident Arab American at this talk, I'd like to kind of incorporate an external perspective for the sake of bringing some dynamicism into the conversation. As we examine and discuss critically from within the US, the situation of human rights in Qatar and the advancement of those, some good things in recent years, as Marty has outlined well. I'd like to shine attention into what many Arab states and politicians and these alike find very frustrating, is this concept of throwing stones from a glass house, whereby the US is perhaps assertive or quick, however you'd like to characterize, with allegations against human rights records in countries in which, meanwhile, a couple examples of the controversial, let's say the abrupt erosion of the constitutionally protected rights for women to get an abortion in 40 minutes ago, or the issue of police brutality of Black Americans, we discussed it. When it comes to a superpower country like the US, how do you reconcile this juxtaposition, particularly in the diplomatic context, as we discuss sports diplomacy? Perhaps a neat opportunity for former ambassadors Susan Ziad to give a response. Thank you in advance.
Susan.
Yes. Well, this has always been a bit of a tough nut to crack, and it's true that we always are open to our own criticism of our own societies. I think increasingly we have to stand by our values and our perspectives and how we as a country view what is important going forward, even if we don't always act in consort with those values that we espouse. And certainly as diplomats, this is something that we continue to push for. It doesn't stop us. And I often did draw on some of our own experiences and the fact that we start and then we stop and we take a step forward and sometimes two steps back. I think, transparency and honesty is always very important. But we always try to share some of our experiences and some of the ways in which we've tried to overcome those boundaries, understanding it can't be a copy paste, that we can't take a blueprint and impose it on these societies that are very different in culture and political systems and contexts, etc. But I think that, frankly, I always was quite happy when an interlocutor in the Qatari government, or I served in Saudi Arabia as well, would ask the question, well, what about in the United States, and point to a particular issue? Because I always feel that it's important even for us as diplomats or for our government to understand that we can't be in the position of just espousing particular positions. If we're going to talk the talk, we have to walk the walk. And that I was always quite happy actually to report back in the cable that this is what was said, because it makes us have to think more about how we have to be more true to our values. And so I think that's an important thing that we as diplomats continue to espouse and will continue to do so moving forward. And maybe even looking at collective ways we can work on these issues together is an important strategy.
I just add a bit to that. Because I completely agree with what Susan said. I think that's exactly right. And I think that, and I would commend to you all the Biden administration's national security strategy that just came out, because I think it thoughtfully tackles this issue, which is to say that we have to acknowledge the challenges that we have in the United States and acknowledge that we don't have all the answers, but we do believe that we have these shared values and we have to live by our principles, and that we know that what happens at home affects what happens overseas. And so it's not that we would say, listen to us despite what's happening here at home on human rights. It's listen to us because we're having these same challenges too, and we're all working through them together in our own ways. And I think that transparency and that willingness that we have in the United States to have an open conversation about human rights, to have the debate, to be able to criticize our government as strenuously as we want to without fear of retribution is a really important point. I mean, at the Summit for Democracy that President Biden hosted last December, the speaker that the administration invited to talk about the United States democracy was extremely critical of the U.S. And it was great. It was very thoughtful. It was really an excellent set of remarks. And I thought there are not that many places in the world where the government would host one of its chief critics to criticize itself at a summit on democracy. And I think that's a hallmark of our system, is we have a lot of issues, but at least we're talking about them openly and freely. And the last thing I'll just say briefly is I take my cue from human rights activists around the world who continue to ask and call on the United States to engage on these issues. So even at our lowest moments on human rights, or even in the last few years when we've been disengaged on human rights and our performance at home has worsened, we still have activists and civil society organizations around the world asking the U.S. for help, asking us to be a moral leader, asking us to be a thought partner, asking us for financial and political support. That has never wavered, because they still see us as an example and a partner in these issues that few other countries are.
One last quick question.
Can I add something in here?
Please.
Yeah, I think the problem that the United States and European countries have, and that goes also for the sports associations, is not just simply domestic issues that call into question the values, but it's also the sense of hypocrisy, looking at it from the outside in, because there's never been an explanation, particularly on the part of the United States, on when do we insist on these values and when do we not insist on these values? And what are the criteria here if you cannot insist on them universally across the board? And if you translate that towards the World Cup, and we were talking about the Danes before, the Danes and other Europeans had no problems playing in the 2018 World Cup in Russia at a time 4 years after they had annexed Crimea and were cracking down on the LGBTQ community. And so legitimately, the question is, if you're standing up for these values, on what grounds do you justify that you're insisting it here, but not or did not insist on it there? And there's never been a sort of roadmap presented of criteria on how and when do you apply these values.
Sir, one quick question.
My name is Zach. I work for National Security Innovation Consultancy, and my question is mainly for Marty, but the other panelists can feel free to answer. Do you expect individual athletes to take a stand? Do you want them to take a stand, or do you see them kind of going in the way of Phil Mickelson with Live Golf, which one week he says, a journalist asks him a question and basically says like MBS is a butcher, and then he's like, oh crap, like they're paying me this amount of money, he's a great guy, or something to that effect.
I would like athletes to take a well-informed stand. I'll put it that way. I think that there's an important role for our social cultural leaders like athletes to stand up for the issues they believe in. I don't have any issue. I think, in fact, it's great for people with a platform to use it. But I think that's a great example of the importance of doing so when you're well informed about an issue, and doing so thoughtfully and strategically, and not doing so when you have a financial interest in the issue that you're commenting on.
Well, I can say with confidence, I have no financial interest in, in tonight's discussion. I think that's true of all of us here. And so,
yeah, I just wanted to say thank you all for coming to tonight's event. It was great to see all of you here. And then a big thank you to all of our panelists, Marty for coming in person. And then a special shout out to James, who is currently in Singapore. So we had to wake up super, super early to come to today's event. So thank you so much for coming. And I hope everyone had a great time and learned a lot about the upcoming World Cup.
Thank you.
Thank you.
thank you. And do eat some more food, please.